The Memory of Love, Chapter 37. Given the extra shifts he'd worked, Kai was owed any number of days off. He let Seligman know he'd be away for a day, preferring to avoid Mrs. Mara. Abbas was on holiday, bored and at home, so Kai had invited him to come along. They left the city by way of the hospital, where Kai checked briefly on for day. A doctor was a farmer, he told Abbas. Patients were crops that had to be watered or cows that needed milking. Together they passed by Adrian's flat and found it empty. Kai noted the reordering of items, the books taken down from their shelves, the pair of coffee mugs. They encounter little traffic and no accidents, and thus make good time. There are vehicle tracks on the road to the falls, a couple of British military observers, a woman and a man picnicking on the rocks, provide theater for a group of children. Kai raises a hand in greeting, but the couple do not return it, and their gaze travels through him. And so, though Kai could free them from the bondage of the children's stares, he chooses not to do so. Abbas goes to fish in the crevices between the rocks. Kai strips down to his shorts and dives into the cool water. The swim does little, though, to ease his restlessness. Like the British couple, he would have preferred to be alone. Once on a trip here with Neneba, they'd been invaded by a group of foreign engineers on a sightseeing trip from the dam. Tejani had driven away to explore the town. The two of them been on the point of making love, interrupted by the arrival of the delegation in khaki shorts and open sandals. By the time Tejani came back, the men were gone. He thought they were fooling. Did Neneba ever come back here? He climbs out and lies upon the rocks. Abbas's shadow looms over him, holding a sand skipper in his cupped hands. The Europeans get up and leave. One more swim, Kai tells Abbas, and then it is time to go. Past the petrol station and the queue of vehicles, they enter the town. In the square, Kai parks the old Mercedes by a row of stalls and climbs down. Abbas is hungry now and hovers in front of the food stalls. They buy chicken and wait while the stallholder griddles it over hot charcoals. Kai buys some bread from a neighboring stall and they eat, leaning against the car. Afterwards, he gets behind the wheel and they move forward at a crawl, driving the route he walked just once, in the middle of a night 6 years ago. Where are we going? Asks Abbas. I'm looking for somebody I met here a long time ago. Will they still be here? I don't know, answers Kai. Abbas winds down his window and hums. Kai is trying to fill the route, pacing his driving against the distantly remembered conversation of that night. The lefts and rights, the layout of the streets could have changed. Back then, they'd been accompanied by soldiers who'd led them, to their surprise, straight to the door. He swings the car around to the right, descends a step section of track. Outside, a low, bunker-shaped building, he halts, orders Abbas to wait, pulls his shirt over his mouth and nose, and pushes at the door. Inside are the old refectory tables, broken glass, and a burnt mattress. Otherwise, no sign of the laboratory that once stood there. Somewhere in this town, Kai has a cousin. In the marketplace, he stops again at the food sellers to ask where he might find the street where the family live. Minutes later, they arrive at the house. Somebody is sent to fetch Ishmael, and he arrives smiling and buttoning his shirt. Punches fits with Kai and then with Abbas. They settled with their backs against the wall. Last time they met was some years before the war, before the city where Kai lived became an island within the rest of the country. Long time, my friend, says Ishmael. What brings you here? Kai tells him he is looking for Dr. Bangura, the Lassa fever specialist. His cousin nods fast, then shakes his head and toots. The doctor is gone, not the war. A pinprick to his finger. He was infected by the disease he'd been researching. Kai is quiet, remembering the doctor working diligently over his samples late into the night. The household rubber gloves, the snorkel and mask in place of proper safety equipment. He would have died in agony. Through the streets of the town, a slow late afternoon stroll. From time to time, Ishmael raises a hand to people sitting on the steps of houses, shakes another's hand, introduces Kai as his brother. Once they pass a house upon whose balcony 6 or so young men lounge. Unlike outside the other houses here, there are no women, no children. Ishmael nods. 1 or 2 nod in return. There are no smiles, and Ishmael does not introduce Kai as he has before. Down a road enclosed by houses on both sides, a bus ahead of them turns and, with a child's expert memory, declares, "This is where we found Uncle Adrian after the bicycle hit him." Ishmael laughs. "Who is this that was hit by a bicycle?" "Uncle Adrian. We found him here and took him home." Ishmael turns questioningly to Kai. Kai lets a bus get ahead once more, before he tells Ishmael. Afterwards, they continue in silence until they reach a motel, partly rebuilt and painted, bristling with bamboo scaffolding. In the courtyard, a nanny goat and her kid are tethered. The goat is bleating, a melancholy repetitive sound. Abbas is given a Fanta, which he carries outside to sit and watch the goat. 2 men are following the football at the bar, dressed in the typical attire of government utility workers. Ishmael leads Kai to a table in the back of the room. "I heard something about this man," he says presently. "The one you say was hit by a bicycle. I heard a stranger was hurt." "Who told you that?" Ishmael shrugs. "People talk." He is sitting hunched over the table, facing Kai, one arm curled around his beer. He speaks in a low voice. "Some bad business. He was attacked," says Kai. He tells Ishmael all he knows about Agnes, Adrian's imprudent visit to her house, the son-in-law. Ishmael nods as if somehow it all makes sense to him. "Do you know what it was about?" asks Kai. Ishmael shakes his head. "There are some bad people here. You were not here during the fighting. You did not see. I was not here much of the time, but I was here before. I came back after and saw how things were different. Now they say it's over, but it is not over. You see those men we passed?" "Who?" Kai looked at the men at the bar. "No, not these ones. Them that we passed in that house. They arrived at that time and they are still here. People want them to go, but they don't go. The government told the fighters to return to their own homes, but many stayed. Why? Maybe because they found a better life. Maybe because they have nowhere else to go." Ishmael shakes his head, positions his beer bottle on the damp cardboard mat, turns the label carefully round to face him and studies it. "So they stayed. Why not? Was it one of them who attacked my friend?" This time Ishmael shakes his head emphatically. "No, I do not think so." He takes a drink of his beer. On the television, a player misses a penalty. One of the men slams his bottle down on the table and exclaims. Ishmael picks at the label on his beer bottle and says no more. Kai decides to confide in Ishmael about his plans to go to America. His cousin grins and congratulates him, raises his beer bottle. They both drink. "When you get there, send something small for me." They finish drinking and Ishmael stands. "Let's go," he says. Outside they collect Abbas, who has collected some grass and leaves and laid them in front of the goat, though his offerings have gone untouched. Maybe she's thirsty, suggests Kai, as Abbas goes to ask the kitchen for a bowl of water. Ishmael says, "This is a good friend of yours." "This man who was beaten?" "Yes," answers Kai. "A good friend. Though he is a visitor here, we have become close through the hospital. I stay at his place often. He wants to help." Ishmael nods. "We should all have friends. Look at Abbas. He can create friends across the species." The goat is down on her front knees, drinking from the bowl. Abbas stands by happily, arms dangling at his sides. They walk out into the darkening streets, back the way they came, until at one point Ishmael turns away from their route, saying, "Let us use this road. Perhaps I know somebody you can talk to." Kai follows, saying nothing. Presently, they reach a house. A curtain hangs in front of the open door. Glimmers of light behind. Ishmael knocks on the door frame, pushing the curtain gently aside. Kai waits. He hears Ishmael speaking to somebody. He is beckoned inside. A woman is sitting on a stool, shelling groundnuts. She wipes her hands on her dress. "I have told her what it is you want to know," says Ishmael. "She's my wife's aunt. She agrees to help you." The woman offers him the back of her wrist. Kai touches it with the back of his own. "Agnes was not always this way," she says. "Before she was like you and me, and then she became crossed." She removes the stool from beneath her, brushes the seat and sets it down. "Please." Kai sits. She offers him some of the groundnuts and leaves the room with Ishmael. Kai prepares to wait. How many hours he sat there he would not later recall. At some point, the boy, sleepy and tired of waiting outside, crept in to be with him, and Kai allowed him to stay, sheltered beneath the wing of his arms. People were sent for: a neighbor, a young woman without a smile, an older woman with a creased face and white hair. Kai waited and listened without interrupting or speaking, except to greet each new arrival. Watch while they took a seat and were told what was required of them. He did not speak, even when they faltered. He offered no solace, but left it to others. Each person told a part of the same story, and in telling another story, they told their own. Kai took what they had given him and placed it together with what he already knew and those things Adrian had told him. This was Agnes's story, the story of Agnes and Nasu, in hushed voices, told behind a curtain in a quiet room and in the eye of the night, from the lips of many. By the time the last speaker had finished, the moon was well past its zenith, and Kai understood the storyteller's courage. Mohammed remembered Nasu, how every Monday she walked the same route to the bus stop, wearing a pair of high-heeled shoes and a suit made of shiny fabric. Every Friday the bus carried her back, and this time she wore a simple cotton dress. On Monday, when she walked to the bus stop, Mohammed and the other young motorbike taxi drivers would watch her pass from their place by the roundabout. Mohammed would sometimes offer her a lift, and sometimes too she accepted. She would sit with her legs to one side and be carried down to the bus stop. A lot of young men had an idea they might put collar for Nasu, who was one of the finest girls in the town, and from a good family. You could see it in the way she held herself. She had the job in the city department store. Some of the young men teased her. "When are you coming to take me to the big city with you, Nasu?" And she smiled and teased them back. She was bold, but in such a way as you understood there was nothing in it, for they had all known each other for a long time. They were her classmates. Everybody knew Nasu. Sometimes she stopped by her father at the nursery with fried donuts for his sweet tooth. They would sit on the frame of an old tractor. If Nasu was sitting with her father outside the nursery, that meant it was a Friday, the day she returned from the city. During the curfew months, she used to arrive home a little earlier, when the buses became cautious about traveling the roads at night. Nasu's father and she ate sugar donuts sitting on the rustling frame of the old John Deere tractor. The last Friday Nasu was home. Nasu was away in the city the day the thin men came to town. This is what Muhammad remembers about Nasu. On market day at 6 o'clock in the morning, Binta rose and dressed, washing from the bucket in the corner of the yard. By 6:30, she was ready to walk the half mile to the town with her small basket of cucumbers and tomatoes. This was the part of the day she liked the best. The moments of quiet on the walk to the town past the sugarcane fields. Within the hour, the sun would be strong enough to dry the dew, drawing spirals of mist from the earth. As Binta passed the avenues of sugarcane, she saw shadows moving between the rows. Somebody's goats must have broken free. On the outskirts of the town, she passed Agnes working in her vegetable garden. They called to one another. Ngadirai, Agnes's husband, was there in the background. The rising sun lent a dark edge to the shape of his body. He was too far away for Binta to greet him, so she walked swiftly on, hoping to beat Agnes, whose tomatoes were always so plump and shiny, to the first of the customers. By 8 o'clock, Binta had set up her stall, and the first buyers had already appeared. Agnes was there, 2 stalls away from Binta. A customer dropped a tomato and Binta bent to retrieve it, annoyed to see it had bruised and the skin was split. While she had her head below the level of the stall, she heard the sound of gunfire. She had heard it before, only never so close. All around her, people started at the sound and began to move, some in one direction and some in another, like a herd of sheep on a road, uncertain in which direction safety lay. In the end, they stood still. A group of men entered the square. One was talking into a megaphone, calling people to gather in the marketplace. This man was wearing fatigues and looked like a soldier, but the men with him were not like soldiers. Soldiers were given more rice than anybody else in the country, and they carried the weight of it upon their bodies. These men were narrow and angular, curiously dressed, jewelry and amulets around their necks, rows of bullets like necklaces, dark sunglasses. Others went barefoot and dressed in rags. Strange, thin men. They reminded Binta of the puppets from the shows she was taken to as a child. They had frightened her even then. The thin men ran around the houses, beating upon the doors and ordering the people outside. There were more sounds of gunfire, of splintering wood, the smell of smoke. The man with the megaphone ordered everybody to sit down. As new people arrived in the square, they were pushed down to the ground. By the end, only the man with the megaphone and his men remained standing. He announced his name, Colonel Jaja, and began to speak. Binta listened. At first, the talk sounded to her like a political speech, with words like government and elections. He told them the government had betrayed the people, and he spoke a name that before she had only read in the newspaper. And she realized who these people were and guessed everybody else did too. Binta's mouth went dry. Colonel Jaja shouted an instruction, and 4 of his men came forward, bearing a pair of bamboo cages strung between poles. In these boxes were men tightly huddled into the small space. One of the boxes was opened, and the man brought out an army soldier, Binta guessed, by what remained of his uniform. He struggled to stand and held his side where his uniform was darkly stained. A rope around his waist led to one of Jaja's men, who pulled at it. The man on the end of the rope offered no resistance and only stumbled after him, his head lowered like a child playing bull. The commander lowered the megaphone from his lips, and his words were lost to Binta. She couldn't take her eyes off the soldier. She missed the motion of the hand to the belt, the drawing of the weapon, the way Jaja took lazy aim before he shot the army soldier in the head. She heard the sound of cheers and claps from Jaja's men. Somebody nearby said, "Okuru, my God." The body lay in the dust, the legs thrashed, and was still. A second cage was opened. Another man brought forward. He held his bound hands up, and Binta could tell he was begging for his life. Seconds later, he too crumpled to the ground. Fear surged through the crowd. People began to panic. The commander spoke into the megaphone and warned them to remain still. Men were brought forward and ordered to move the bodies. Binta recognized them as the workers from the nursery, Agnes's husband among them. She heard Agnes's gasp. The report of the gun, Jaja's voice, Agnes's gasp. Other than these sounds, it seemed to Binta everything she was watching happened in silence. Dark smoke drifted beyond the roofs of the houses, and the dusty smell of burning brick reached the square, carrying with it the magnitude of what was happening that day. In the middle of the square, Agnes's husband, the eldest of the men, was struggling under the weight of one of the corpses. He was recently out of hospital, where he'd had an hernia operation. Agnes had talked to Binta about it. He stumbled, was hit by one of the thin men, and fell to the ground. The other nursery workers stood still. Binta saw them turn open-handed to Jaja, remonstrating, the way people do when they are afraid. From where she stood, she could sense the anger in Jaja, for Binta had known men like him in her life. Men who yearned to inspire fear in others, and yet were angered when they saw it, for it reminded them of themselves. The nursery men, though, seemed not to understand, and kept coming. Their palms turned upwards. Agnes's husband clambered to his knees, holding his stomach, and reached out his free hand to touch Jaja. No, thought Binta, don't touch him. The old man's fingers grasped at the colonel's clothing. The young commander stepped out of reach, then turned and walked away. For several seconds, he stood motionless, with his back to them all. Binta stopped breathing. Suddenly, Jaja swung around and returned to the old man with a swift, unbroken stride, raised his weapon and shot him in the chest. There were screams, the sound of more shots, this time into the air. Somebody held on to Agnes, but there was nobody to hold her younger daughter, Yalie, who ran to her father where he lay. The thin men gathered around, laughing until one of them pulled her away. Jaja snatched a mattock from one of his men. Binta saw again the certainty in his movements. The thin man stood back while he hacked at the nursery worker's neck with the blade, picked up the head and tossed it to Yalie, who instinctively reached out to catch it. The thin man cheered again. Agnes's husband's death was the first of many. Afterwards, the thin men were unleashed upon the town. This was the advance party. Now the war is over. She knows their name, G5. She has had it broadcast on the radio, responsible for coordinating relations between the civilian population and the rebel movement, according to the spokesman for the rebels. Some called it the sensitization unit. There, Binta stops speaking. Her hands have remained in her lap, still and quiet, her palms flat on her thighs, long tapered fingers. The nursery was on the way into town. Somebody explains to Kai. They took the men from there as they entered the town over the bridge. Yes, Kai nods. 11 o'clock. In the chair is a woman in her 50s, cropped gray hair and a thin scar enfolded by the soft flesh of her cheeks. Isata was in the refugee camps in Guinea with Agnes and with her 2 years later when they made the long journey by foot back to the town. In the camp, it seemed they faced more dangers than on the outward journey. In the forest, the dangers were from snakes, buffalo, and rebel soldiers. In the camps, there was hunger, typhoid, and cold. But the greatest threat of all came from their own kind, gangs of men who searched the weak out from among the rest, those without family, women without menfolk, The first day they arrived, Isata and Agnes saw a row of girls lying at the edge of the camp, blood leaking from between their open legs. And on many mornings to come, the bodies of young women were found dumped behind the tents, their lappers bunched around their waists. During the day, families came to collect the bodies of their daughters. Those girls without family remained where they lay. Agnes and her two daughters were alone without men. So Isata invited Agnes, Yali, and Marianne to share a tent with her and her son, just 15. Hassan had run out of time to become a man. They survived by clinging to order, queuing for food, washing their clothes in the river, fetching water, hunting for firewood and edible plants in pairs. Scrubbing down the sides of the tent became a daily routine. In the evening, they slept together, and Isata's son lay across the entrance. Outside, lean shadows stalked between the tents. They prayed nobody would notice they were 4 women protected only by a young boy. The refugees lived in fear of rebel raids, but those never came. Instead, 2 cholera epidemics arrived within the first year. The third took Yali. Marianne died 6 months later, poisoned by a cut on her foot. The day after Marianne's death, Agnes disappeared. Isata and her son searched the camp until dusk drove them to their tent. All night, Isata lay awake, fearing for Agnes, for if age was a woman's protection at home, it was no protection here. The next day, she found Agnes sitting on the other side of the stream, unharmed. She guided her back to the tent. For days, Agnes neither spoke nor moved nor ate. Isata was not disturbed by Agnes, for many were the women who mourned in such a way. Order, Isata never lost her belief in it. After a few days, she egged Agnes on through a rigid routine of her own devising. Every morning after bathing, they went to the Red Cross tent to check the list of new arrivals. In nearly 2 years, Agnes had had no news of Nasu, but they'd both heard of the sacking of the city where they thought Nasu must be living without a father, a mother, or a husband. The Red Cross tent was where people exchanged news of home. New arrivals were especially sought after, for the information they might bring with them. In this way, they learned of the turn in events, the troops who had come from overseas, the regaining mile by mile of rebel-held territory. Now, after 18 months of fighting, the government had almost reached the border and the camps. More and more of the new arrivals were people traveling from one refugee camp to another, searching for loved ones. One day, a Red Cross worker approached Agnes and asked her name. "Follow me," she said. "We are holding a message for you." The message had been there for a month. It was from Nasu, searching for her father, her mother, and sisters. Nasu traveled to the halfway point of their journey home to meet them. Agnes, Isata, and Hassan had walked the distance. Now there were vehicles on the roads, and with Nasu's money, they were able to obtain transport the rest of the way. In the back of the Poda Poda, Nasu told her story. She had stayed in the city for almost a year, sheltering in the house of a workmate. After the arrival of the foreign troops, she waited until she heard it was safe to return to her hometown. 14 months after the Friday when she had sat with her father and eaten donuts on the John Deere tractor, Agnes embraced Nasu and said her father and sisters were dead, and in her choice of words, let Nasu believe they had all died in the camps together. Nasu wept. Isata stared at Nasu, so beautiful and healthy. There was flesh on her arms. Her hair was black where theirs had turned dry and red. Such elegant clothes. Nasu explained that she had met a man who offered to take care of her and she had married him. She begged her mother's forgiveness for marrying without her permission, and Agnes gave it easily, for a good man was what she had prayed Nasu might find. That at least was God's true work. Then Nasu reached across, took her mother's hand, and placed it on her belly. Agnes felt the roundness of her daughter's stomach and for the first time, Isata saw her friend cry. In this way, they made the journey home. The marketplace was empty. They saw nobody. Many houses were abandoned, others destroyed. They reached Agnes's home first, and what she saw silenced Isata. The house was neat, and the plaster was new. Chairs stood on the veranda, much as they had 2 years before. It was all her husband's doing, Naasu told them, as she ran up the stairs. It was nearly dark, and she invited Isata and her son to eat with them and to stay the night, since the food they had brought with them was finished. Isata accepted. The three waited while Naasu went to find her husband. Isata thought of her own house and wondered what she would find the next morning. She was happy for Agnes and envied her too. Soon Naasu returned, her new husband following behind. Naasu was smiling, a sheen of excitement upon her skin as she brought him forward to greet her mother. The man stepped out from under the eaves of the house and into what remained of the light. The old woman stopped speaking. She is no longer looking at Kai, but down at her own lap. He can hear her breathing. There is silence. Somebody in the room urges her to continue. It is Ishmael's aunt. The old woman looks to her and then back down at her hands. What did you see? Asks Kai, speaking for the first time. She swallows and her voice drops almost to a whisper. I saw Jaja. They are driving through the dark, Abbas wide awake in the passenger seat, buckled in by his seatbelt. Kai drives at some speed, propelled by what lies behind him, slowing for the bright lights that come at him out of the darkness. Ishmael had accompanied him as they made their way slowly down darkened streets back to Old Faithful. Kai unlocked the car, and Abbas climbed inside. He turned to Ishmael and put out his hand. Automatically, they clasped hands and clicked thumbs and fingers. Kai thanked him. Ishmael inclined his head. They stood a while in silence until, as though in completion of some shared observation, Ishmael shied and said, So now you see us here. This is God's wish. Is that what you believe? You ask me one day, I would answer no. I don't believe it. You ask me the next day, after these things have occurred, I would not know how to answer you. Such things happened everywhere. For what reason, I cannot tell you. No, Kai sighed and shook his head. Nobody can. So what is there to do but pray? Kai hadn't answered. Instead, he embraced his cousin, slipped behind the wheel of the vehicle, and drove out of the town. He remembers now that they've eaten nothing since the chicken they bought in the marketplace. He pulls over at the next junction and buys 4 ears of roast corn. They drive on. Better, he says to Abbas. The boy nods. He has been silent since they left the town. Instead, he has been sitting, watchful and still, gazing at the darkness ahead of them, and blinking even in the face of the oncoming headlights. So the man killed the lady's husband and then married her daughter, Abbas says. Kai doesn't spare the child, but replies, yes. And now she has to live with him and keep quiet because her daughter doesn't know what he did. He had been listening to every word spoken in the house. That's right, says Kai. And everybody else keeps quiet too? Yes. What about us? Kai turns briefly to look at Abbas, who does not return his look, but stares straight ahead. The darkness seems to hurtle at them, breaking apart on the windscreen and closing up again in their wake. Abbas says, Do we have to keep quiet? No, says Kai. No, we do not. What if we lived in that town? Would you have to be quiet then? In the silence, all Kai can hear is the rush of air. I do not know, he says. The hospital is in darkness, save for the glow of security lights. Kai and Abbas pass the wards. A door stands ajar. Through the gap, he can see a nurse at her station. Hushed footsteps whispers, the slow squeak of wheels and of rubber on linen. Kai unlocks the door of Adrian's apartment and switches on the main light. There are books, the pair of mugs on the table, and disturbed since morning. He turns and leaves.